Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Annalise Mathers, and I am a research officer at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. I'm delighted to be your co-moderator for tonight's discussion on climate-conscious pharmacy. Before we start tonight's discussion, I would just like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Tonight's panel is brought to you in partnership by the Office of Advancement and Alumni Relations and the Center for Practice Excellence at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. And we're also generously sponsoring tonight's event with Shoppers Drug Mart. Co-moderating tonight's panel with me is Emily Musing, who's from the class of 8T3 BSc Pharm, and is also our leader in residence at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy.
Thanks, Annalise. So we know that environmental sustainability in both our professional and personal lives is an urgent priority if we're to meet the climate impact goals to reduce global warming. Climate-conscious pharmacy practice can contribute positively and significantly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon footprint. So today's panel will explore areas where we need to do better and offer us some advice about emerging best practices on becoming more climate conscious in our industry. So I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers for the evening. First, Zubin Austin is the Academic Director, Center for Practice Excellence, and Professor and Koffler Chair at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. We also have Jamie Park. Jamie is a research pharmacist with CASCADES, Center for Sustainable Health Systems, Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation, University of Toronto. We also have Peter Tolios, who is the Director of Pharmacy Operations Innovations for Shoppers Drug Mart, and Yifan Zhou is the Chairperson of External Relations for the International Pharmaceutical Students Federation. So welcome, everyone. I think we're going to have a really good evening.
Thanks so much, Emily. We definitely have an incredible panel with us tonight. And so I think just to get us started and just so the audience has a bit of a sense of who you are behind the titles that Emily just read out, I'd love for each of you to share with the audience a little bit about your professional and or personal connection to climate conscious pharmacy practice. And I'd love if you could share with us how this topic is currently shaping some of the work that you're undertaking. Yifan, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you, Annalise, and thank you, Emily, for introducing me. So as mentioned, my name is Yifan, and I'm the Chairperson of External Relations at IPSF. And IPSF has a developing focus on climate change, which is why we've been trying to get accreditation from the UN agency, UNFCCC, which is the climate change group. And we actually got their accreditation last year, and I was able to represent the Federation at COP27, which is Conference of Parties that was taking place in Egypt. So over there, civil society, policymakers, and also private and public sectors come together to discuss climate action. So over there, we were trying to build awareness around health and climate change, and also how, as part of my portfolio, we can form climate-related partners. So that's how it's been shaping my work. And one of the cool things that I discovered there is that there's also a health policy working group where healthcare professionals kind of follow the negotiations from country teams, and they actually identify areas where they can go in and discuss how health can be put on the agenda so that we can work on climate change and health together. So that's how I got started.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Yifan. I think it's also just so important to have people like yourself as a pharmacist and a recent grad at those discussions with other healthcare providers. So we're very glad to get into some of the details of that tonight. Jamie, I'll ask you to comment next.
Thanks, Annalise. Great to be here. We see news about climate crises quite regularly, perhaps more frequently than before across Canada and globally. It may seem that it's a problem in the future, but in reality, we're actually experiencing its impact and its harm to human health. So for me, my connection to climate conscious pharmacy practice really began when I learned about how healthcare services and systems contribute to climate change. This led me to reflect on my area of practice and potential areas of improvement to minimize environmental harms to medications and to address increased medication-related risks due to climate change. The passion of mine motivated me to work with CASCADES to raise awareness of the issue, highlighting the roles pharmacists can play, in addition to developing and sharing practice and educational resources for pharmacy professionals.
That's great. Thank you so much. We're definitely excited to learn more about some of the outputs that CASCADES has produced. And I know that you've been really spearheading. So it's really also quite exciting just to see the combined clinical practice with some research and knowledge mobilization to really get the word out about what's happening, but also what can be done. Zubin, I'd like to pose this question to you next.
Sure. I guess selfishly, my interest in climate change stems from simply being middle-aged. If you are my age or older, you've actually seen the reality of climate change in our lifetimes. Winters aren't what they used to be. The intensity and ferocity of summer storms aren't what they used to be. A lot of this really crystallized for me during the pandemic. During the pandemic, I had the good fortune of being able to shift operations from downtown Toronto, where I have lived and worked for 35 years, to a cottage on Lake Erie. And when you're outside of a big city and you live for the entire time outside of a big city, you become abundantly aware of actually how ferocious climate change is and how it's affecting things. Everything from the shoreline of Lake Erie. If any of you live in the area, you know that over Christmas this year, we had a 3-day blizzard. 3 consecutive days of an ice storm. It took out our power for 5 days. Just 2 hours outside of downtown Toronto, and the visibility of climate change impact on us is huge. I'm fortunate to have a backup generator. I'm fortunate to have a resilient structure to live in. And so I can't imagine what it's like for the other 80% of the world that doesn't have this. And so feeling firsthand the impacts of climate change right here in Southern Ontario really lit a fire under me to look at this from a research perspective. So along with you, Annalise, we have been applying for and successfully receiving grants to develop new initiatives. Our most recent one involved the development of a self-audit instrument for community pharmacists to help them to see what opportunities exist in their practice to have more climate conscious practices that can impact on carbon footprint.
Thank you for sharing that, Zubin. And I think it's a bit bittersweet to hear about the personal connection and the personal story behind sort of, what's led you to really undertake a lot of critical research in this space. But I think it's also something probably all of us on this call can relate to in some way, shape, or form of really seeing changes within our communities and for our loved ones. And just the impact on human health at the same time. So very important work. Peter, how about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and similar to Zubin, I think today's been a bit of an interesting day for me. I'm actually in Halifax supporting with kind of the expansion of the PANS-led primary care clinics that we're opening as part of Shoppers Drug Mart's support in this. But we spent most of our day speaking with patients that have been relocated and impacted by the fires and wildfires that are currently happening in this region. So, having this conversation this evening really, I think, resonates on the type of role that we can play as pharmacists in terms of, again, our patient care component, how we can support our communities, but also what we can do in order to, again, support from a climate change and being more climate conscious. So, I learned very early on in my career that, as Zubin alluded to, Canadians, our patients, our customers, they're increasingly passionate about environmental sustainability. And that's something that does come up during our conversations with our patients. So, at Loblaw and by extension at Shoppers Drug Mart, we have priority areas where we believe we can make that biggest impact for our communities and our stakeholders. So fighting climate change is one of those pillars, as well as advancing social equity. Part of the solution for fighting climate change is eliminating food, medication waste, as well as reducing plastic waste. We have our environmental social governance work that shapes the decisions that we make as a company. And this work is ingrained in our day-to-day operations. When I think of a personal example, many of you on this panel know that a few years ago, about 6 years ago, I was leading the operations for a central fill facility pilot for Shoppers Drug Mart, where we centrally filled compliance packs for our stores. Since this initial pilot, we're now on a journey of national expansion. We have multiple facilities across the country. We're not only doing compliance packs, but refills for our patients. And as part of this journey, we have a goal of achieving over 50% centralization of dispensing. Naturally, this opens up, I think, the door to leverage bulk stock bottles in our efforts to reduce plastic. Internally, we have kind of over-the-counter Life brand products that have answered the call in this regard. And just a simple example where we can drive this kind of reduction in plastic. One of our large stock bottles is the equivalent of 8.5 of the store size bottles that you would see that a patient would purchase. So containing the same quantity of tablets. So again, a very small example of where some of these interventions, I think, can support in fighting climate change, reducing plastic usage and waste, and helping achieve our company's goal of net zero emissions for enterprise operations by 2040.
Fantastic. Thanks, Peter. It's funny, you call it a small problem, but I was like, the scale, just what you've described of one large stock bottle replacing 8 or even almost 9 smaller bottles, that's to me really a big change, that also requires a bit more of a broader thinking, like maybe what's going on at Shoppers and Loblaws. And I think that that's just so important because those initiatives, might really be able to take traction in individual community pharmacies that are perhaps independently owned. And I think that's fantastic that people can have the initiative and the autonomy to do that. But I think having change on a large scale, like you've mentioned with Shoppers and Loblaws that have stores across the country, requires sort of that big push, I'll call it. So great to hear about that. I'd like to pass it over to Emily next, who's going to get us going with our next question.
Great. So I think always one of the beauties of having a panel like this is we have people from so many different areas of pharmacy, bring so many different perspectives. So I'm going to ask each of you to think back to what you yourself are involved in or see other pharmacists around you being involved in, and share with us your thoughts with regards to what you think are some of the more effective or most effective strategies to mitigate climate change and to promote environmental sustainability. I'm going to start by asking Jamie.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. When I think about the strategies to guide more environmentally sustainable climate resilient pharmacies, I find it helpful to first categorize them into 2 important ways. There's mitigation. So how are you going to reduce the environmental harms of medications? And we have adaptations. So how are we going to adapt to the stresses of climate change to build more climate resilient pharmacies? So the Pharmacy Playbook by CASCADES Canada shares great practice considerations for Canadian pharmacy professionals, as well as resources and local and international examples to learn more about. And today I'd like to share some few strategies on medication optimization and pharmacy operation. So I'll start by medication optimization. And one of the mitigation strategies is to recommend change from high carbon or high environmental impact medications to lower impact alternatives where appropriate. As the audience may be familiar, a high impact area for intervention is regarding switching meter dose inhalers to alternatives such as dry powder inhalers or soft mist inhalers. And just to provide a brief background information, so the meter dose inhalers utilize HFS propellants, which act as potent greenhouse gases, which are released into the atmosphere. So switching to MDL alternatives can really help reduce the carbon footprint of inhalers. But I would also like to mention that switching is not the only way. An equally important aspect is patient education. So educating patients on proper inhaler techniques and proper disposal should be highlighted as well. And the other one that I would like to share is about adaptation. And you may remember back in 2017, there were critical drug shortages due to Hurricane Maria. So to be prepared for these natural disasters, an important adaptation strategy is to review the disaster preparedness for the pharmacy regularly to ensure continuity of care. So what can pharmacists do? If there isn't one, the initial step would be to first establish and review policies on procurement and recommendations for managing shortages. And another is to identify patient populations that are profoundly impacted during extreme weather events and to ensure appropriate protocols are in place. So for example, patients receiving opioid agonist therapies or daily dispensing of medications might be especially affected by extreme weather events, as they would need to be physically present to receive their medication. Thank you.
That's great. I think you gave us some really crisp ideas to think about. I'm going to point now to Zubin. Zubin, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me pick up the ball from Jamie here. And one of my sort of focuses right now is thinking about how the intersection of our expanding scope of practice as pharmacists can actually have a profoundly positive impact on climate change. For example, deprescribing. As pharmacy as a profession thinks more and gets more actively involved in deprescribing, and as scope of practice continues to accelerate and allows us to have a more independent deprescribing practice, this is a tremendous opportunity to reduce carbon footprint. The first R of reduce, recycle, reuse is reduce. And if we can actually reduce the volume, the amount of prescription drugs, that's a benefit for patients. If patients are actually taking medications they don't need, and we can identify that and act on it with our scope of practice, it also has the additional advantage of reducing carbon impacts. And so that part of scope of practice, I think, is really intriguing in terms of pharmacy having an impact on climate change. The other area which I think is intriguing, and we see it in some parts of Canada and hopefully soon in Ontario, is the availability of therapeutic substitution as an independent scope of practice activity. Pharmacists, as they become more informed and aware of lower carbon alternatives to prescribed medications, should have the authority to use carbon footprint as a parameter for substitutions in the way we use side effects or cost or patient acceptability. If we actually include climate impacts as one of the criterion upon which we assess the utility of a drug for a specific patient, and we're able to use therapeutic substitutions as a way to shift towards more climate-friendly alternatives, again, not only is this a win for the patient, it's a win for the environment and something that can be enabled through our expanding scope of practice.
Wow, you've given me quite something to think about. It had not occurred to me to think of it from that perspective, but thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it to Ifan now. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Jamie and Zubin. You have raised really important points. And from my perspective, I would like to say there could be policy changes on an organizational level. So if you put climate change as one of the priorities in your organization or institution, then that will more effectively gather more people's interests into making things that are more environmentally friendly and thinking of ways that could help mitigate the change in climate. So one of the examples from what I see is actually an organization called Planetary Health Report Card, or PHRC. What they do is they're a group of kind of healthcare students who started this. They evaluate their universities or schools based on the metrics that they've developed, mainly kind of understanding whether they have these curriculum on climate change in their healthcare professional schools, if the campus has any sustainability actions, and if there's any support for students. So with this, they have evaluated over 90 schools, and pharmacy schools are actually one of their newer kind of missions. And through this initiative, they've been able to raise more awareness about the need for climate change, integrate it into the kind of educational curriculum, and that has actually inspired some changes in universities in trying to advocate for that inclusion. So I think for me, policy and organizational level would be an important thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ifan. So, Peter, you're the last up. I mean, you represent in many ways, corporate thinking on this topic. And you've heard what different people have said around the table now, linked to whether it's patient education, deprescribing, therapeutic substitutions. What are you seeing in Shoppers Drug Mart that's impacting climate change? Where do you think it's going from your perspective?
Yeah, some great examples that have been brought. I think as part of this discussion, truthfully, as the largest purchaser for pharmaceuticals and pharmacy supplies, we also need to lead the way when it comes to reduction of plastics, continuing the shift towards more sustainable and recyclable options. It's surprising to many, I'm sure, but our prescription bags historically have not been recyclable. Changing and converting to recyclable options is going to have a huge shift in that regard without really any change to patient behavior. Going back to kind of central fill is another intervention that we've made. Those bubble packs and the blister packs themselves, because of the vinyl coating, were not recyclable. So we actually were able to go back to our third-party vendors and challenge them to make those compliance packs and blister packs completely recyclable for our patients. This resulted in, we do about 5.5 million cards annually as a company. That's 66,000 kilograms of plastic that would have gone to the landfill that is now able to be recycled. Again, I think we're also internally reviewing any of our store supplies. Can we manage, reduce overstock in the pharmacy to support better environmental choices and maximize that recyclability? I think, again, it's working with those vendors is kind of where we are able to have a little bit more influence, but I can also appreciate the cascade effect that this would have on really anyone in the community pharmacy landscape. I want us to also maybe think outside of the four walls of the dispensary. As part of Shoppers Drug Mart, I think we also want to talk about not just medication or plastic waste, but we offer food products at our stores. We also participate in food rescue programs where our associate owners, pharmacy teams are also involved in this, where Shoppers Drug Marts across the country, coast to coast, are part of our platform that is working with Second Harvest. So this platform allows donations for nutritious food to charities that are within 10 kilometers of our stores that support, local and at-risk members of our community. So that's that social equity piece as well. That is also founded in climate conscious decisions that we're making. So I just love these food initiatives, these drives where we're removing food waste, but also supporting Canadians in need. So I think it's again, not just pharmacy, not just our dispensary, but what role can community pharmacies as a whole play in their communities as well?
Thank you. I mean, I'm so inspired from hearing about all these things. It makes me want to run out and join one of you in all the work that you're doing. I'm going to ask the other part of this, which is, from the other side of the coin. What are some of the biggest roadblocks or barriers that you see for more environmentally sustainable initiatives in pharmacy being implemented, and whether it's in pharmacy or even in other healthcare settings? And I'm going to go through the same list in the same order. So we're going to start off with Jamie.
Thanks, Emily. I think the biggest challenge from my perspective is the limited literature and the resources available for Canadian pharmacy professionals. When reviewing the literature, most of the resources were created for an international pharmacists. And so there are, from what I was able to see, there were limited literature and practical guidance tailored to Canadian pharmacists. And another one is when creating these climate conscious pharmacy practice considerations is the validation piece. Most of the literature are white papers, case studies, or data from other countries or healthcare professions. So there's a strong need for further knowledge generation in this area.
Okay, and I'm counting on all of you because you are leaders in the field, to play that lead and write some of those papers, and also get the people. There are many people in the audience today that are very interested in this topic to collaborate to make that happen. But thanks, Jamie. Okay, Zubin.
So first of all, Jamie, Aoife, Pete, I welcome you to sign up to do PhDs with me in this area. We're always looking for great graduate students to explore climate conscious practice. To me, actually, the single biggest barrier is a kind of overwhelming fatigue. Almost any if you're attending tonight's session, you know about climate change, you buy into climate change, you know it's a problem, you want to do something about it. Even if you're not attending tonight's session, the vast majority of pharmacists understand and accept the science behind climate change and know something needs to be done. But it just feels so large and overwhelming, and Little old me, well, if I use 8.5 stock bottles versus one of Peter's gigantic stock bottles, it's not going to make that much of a difference, is it? That sense of being overwhelmed and it's little old me, what can I possibly do and how can I possibly matter? I think that's probably the single most important thing we really need to help people overcome. Every single step matters, every single contribution, every reduced, reused, or recycled element of what we do in pharmacy in a small way matters. And the term climate consciousness is not meant to guilt people into doing anything. It's not meant to be about big sticks bashing people on the head. It's simply about this idea of being mindful, intentional, aware, being conscious that small changes actually, if we all can do them, will have big impacts.
Thank you. Okay, Ethan, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Emily. And for me, I also see my point, the policy level of including climate change on an organizational level as being one of the barriers, because there is a lack of information. So Zubin has mentioned that pharmacists can incorporate carbon footprint into their recommendations, but there's a lack of information of the carbon footprint of different medications. So when you don't have that information, how can you then recommend these medications? And as Jamie mentioned, we are powerful educators, but there's not a lot of kind of curricula inclusion of climate change that's integrated into our practice or our education. So that's also something that we need to focus on. And then I guess the last thing is something I heard at COP27, which resonated really well with me. So it's about kind of looking around, not just to see who is in the room, but also who is not in the room. And you can see that a lot of the times, the important stakeholders, policymakers, the people who can make those changes in order to make the climate change action happen are not really in the room. So it's really important that we invite them and, transmit this information to them so that they can also make the changes. So yes.
Great, thank you. As I listen to this, I'm taking notes, but I'm sure other people are as well, because I think that as you talk about roadblocks, at the same time, what we should be thinking of are then how do we respond to those roadblocks? What is it that we can do, whether it's through changing a curriculum, inviting those people that are not in the room right now to participate and increasing that awareness, looking at it even from small changes that we can make personally, or looking at how do we actually create that literature, that validation that's needed. So keep that in mind. Peter, yourself?
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at it from two perspectives. So, as a company, one of the things that we realized very early on is the long lead times when it comes to stability studies for changing the pack sizes. So it's not as simple as asking for a larger bottle, but what does that mean from a stability perspective? Third-party vendors needing to do the appropriate research there when it comes to bulk packaging. So we are moving the needle, I think, in the right direction, but it is taking a little bit of time. On a personal level, as a pharmacist, it's almost, we don't know where to start. And to Zubin's point, how much is enough, or what am I doing in terms of contributing? I think conversations like this evening's is a huge kind of way, or a great way for people to start thinking about climate change, thinking about examples where they can make these small interventions, and every little bit counts. And if we can inspire somebody today to make a few small interventions in their day-to-day operations in their pharmacy, or how they think about medication management for their patients and medication adherence programs, I think it all matters, right? So no matter how small, it is making a difference. So.
Thank you. What I always hope happens during these panel discussions is it really lights a fire in the people, not just the people speaking tonight, but the people that are in the audience. Any of these ideas that are being discussed currently in the panel discussion can be taken and can be spun out so that a group of people that are interested can take that to that next level. And I'd love to see that happen. Annalise, I'm going to pass it back to you for the next question.
Thanks, Emily. And just adding on to what you said, I completely agree with your thoughts and Peter and the rest of our panel remarks. But I think one of the most incredible things I've seen happening in this space is people connecting and people sharing examples, but also connecting in a way that there's a little bit more momentum and a little bit more community behind some of these initiatives and sharing of research. And so I think that that's so fantastic. Peter, I think I'd like to swing back to you immediately for this next question. So we've talked a little bit, community pharmacies obviously can really serve as a real foundation for patients and sustainability initiatives. You've talked a little bit about, how community pharmacies can act as a bit of a central hub for stewardship practices, specifically for medication take-back programs, some of the waste reduction you've mentioned. And I think also community pharmacists can play a role as educators. So my question to you is, can you share what you envision as community pharmacy's role in creating a sustainable healthcare system, and just maybe draw on some examples from your work as well?
Yeah, and I think we've done a lot of, as you said, mitigation, plastic reduction. But to your point, we are these hubs. We're readily available, most accessible healthcare provider by far. And part of the services we are providing are these medication handling education sessions, disposing of medications, prescriptions and non-prescription drugs appropriately, bringing them back to the pharmacy. I think, we have active programs where operationally, nationally, thousands of kilograms, 26,000 kilograms of medications expire on our shelves every year at Shoppers Drug Mart. So we need to also think about operationally, how do we improve our order management system in order to reduce that medication waste? Think of all the back-ordered medication issues that I think was brought up earlier during this conversation. Increased costs to the healthcare system. So as we're talking about sustainability of the healthcare system in the future, this, I think, is also a critical initiative as pharmacists, aimed at making sure that we are good stewards for the medication supply that we are ultimately responsible and have access to. So again, I think this is not something that even the smallest pharmacy will need to have a lot of resources to be able to do. It's reviewing your inventory management protocols, seeing where there's maybe some opportunities to reduce how many medications you have on the shelf. And this simple act will, again, I think, have a great impact on the reduction of medication waste, and again, allow for more equitable access to these medications and overall a more sustainable healthcare system at large.
And actually, if I could just pick up on something you've said, Peter, in the research groups that I connect with and the tables that I sit at that focus on sustainability in healthcare, I think there's actually a growing recognition that if healthcare is going to do anything meaningful as a collective industry, it's actually going to be led by pharmacy. That initially people thought, okay, we need to get to physicians or we need to get to nurses because they're the ones that are closest to patients. But if you think about what pharmacy is in the healthcare system, it's all about, manufacturing, distribution, storage, procurement, disposal, as well as safe and effective use of medications and medical supplies and medical equipment. And another, I think, unique advantage of pharmacy from a climate mitigation perspective is that it's a highly corporatized profession. And I know I don't need to tell you this, Peter, but there's controversy about the role of corporations in pharmacy. But one thing that corporations can do is what you are doing, is use the heft of a corporation to achieve broader objectives. And so the idea that across different health professionals and researchers in this space, there's a growing recognition that if we are going to do anything in healthcare to reduce climate impacts, it's probably going to be led by the pharmacy profession.
No, absolutely. And it just goes back to volume, right? I think you mentioned numerous examples where pharmacy, and it's not just community pharmacy, it's industry, et cetera, where there's a role that everyone can play, especially even in research, that will, again, I think, help support some of those initiatives around climate change.
Yeah. Thanks for your thoughts on that, Peter, and thanks also for chipping in, Zubin. Really interesting. And I think, Peter, I'm even catching up a little bit and thinking about, there truly are all those community pharmacy activities that, Zubin just went through. But in the case of some of the stores under Loblaws, it's also about, like you said, groceries and what do we do with food wastage, which is, I think, also sort of part of that bigger picture of, planetary health and plastics and recycling. So yeah, that's sort of an expansive thought I'm having as we're talking through this, is community pharmacies are also really well positioned because they don't just dispense and sell medication. Lots to think about. Sorry, go ahead. Do you want to add in more?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
going back to not just pharmacy, right? Like we part of grocery, we talked about Second Harvest. We're working with zoos. So Toronto Zoo has kind of a relationship with, again, medication or food waste that is not able to be, kind of repurposed for any type of human consumption. We're working with the zoos to help support with, again, kind of finding a purpose for development of other products or other strategies where we're really doing everything possible to, again, mitigate some of that waste which would naturally go to a landfill, right? So we're obviously in the lens of pharmacy, and we're talking in a pharmacy landscape, but there's lots of things that we can do outside of even our profession and our work on our day-to-day to also have a positive impact to the environment.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing. Emily, I'll flip it back over to you for our next question.
Okay, so I'm going to focus my question to Zubin. Zubin, at the beginning of this talk, when you talked about some of your the reasons why you're focused on climate change, you're interested in it now, you mentioned your age. And I think that people that are older, that have been living in the world for a while, we all take some responsibility for the situation we currently are in with regards to climate change. But I always think that one thing we can look forward to, hopefully, is our students, our new graduates, going out there and becoming the leaders that will help us deal with some of the issues that we have created on ourselves and that have put us where we are at now. So I'm going to ask you as an educator now, how do you see the topic of climate conscious pharmacy practice emerging across the educational landscape in the coming years? And what do you see as some of the fundamentals that our pharmacy graduates should be equipped with as they step into the various practices and practice landscapes?
Well, thanks for asking that question. And it's interesting for those of us that work in an educational space. It reflects the general issue, I think, with climate change for society as a whole. And that's the central problem of crowding. A pharmacy program is a pretty intense educational program filled with a lot of important courses, and a lot of important things need to be covered in a pharmacy program. And now on top of that, we need to start thinking about artificial intelligence. And now, on top of that, we need to start thinking about social inequities, things like Black Lives Matter and truth and reconciliation. And now, on top of that, ... A pharmacy curriculum is getting more and more crowded with things that are essential, but it's still limited in time and there's limited bandwidth for students. Our friend and co-moderator on this panel today, Annalise Mathers, just actually wrote an article recently published in the Canadian Pharmacy Journal that I encourage you all to look it up, that really served as a call for pharmacy educators to look at how climate change can be incorporated and integrated into the curriculum. I think it's generally safe to say that students as a whole understand the urgency. Students as a whole want to do something about climate change. And so it becomes a strategic or a tactical kind of an approach about, okay, in an already crowded curriculum, what can you do? Today, I would say my main priority as an educator is to find ways of including climate consciousness into the therapeutic thought process that our students use, are taught, and rely upon to make clinical decisions every day. If we can embed climate consciousness into therapeutic decision making in the same way we embed side effects, cost of medications, patient adherence, all of those things that are just the way pharmacists think about medications, if we can find a way of putting climate consciousness into that list, I think it opens up tremendous possibilities as our scope of practice expands for things like deprescribing, for things like therapeutic substitution, for things like prescribing. And so it may sound like a very modest goal, but I think trying to find ways of putting climate consciousness on par with all the other criteria pharmacists use on a day-to-day basis in assessing appropriateness of medications could have an enormous effect. And it's the sort of thing that can be relatively easily integrated into existing educational programs.
I really love that. I mean, you mentioned, you say that it's a modest thing, but I think it's a really big thing. You know, regardless of what the topic is. I mean, currently, you know, the thing I'm interested in is in leadership. And prior to that, my interest is in safety. And I always think that the way to make something happen is to find a way to incorporate it into everything that we do on a daily basis. So it does not exist in isolation. And I think that's what you're saying here. How do we build climate consciousness into every aspect of the curriculum, and then ultimately in every aspect of the daily practice of a pharmacist?
Exactly. I think if we had a course called Climate Conscious Pharmacy, it wouldn't work. But if climate consciousness is just the kind of thing that you do, and you are graded on the climate consciousness of your therapeutic choices and decisions, if you are assessed in an OSCE in the way you actually educate patients around the risks associated with dehydration, if they're taking medications that may be leaving them heat vulnerable, it's just an everyday part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. But embedding climate consciousness into the therapeutic thought process is sort of, like, currently at least, I think possibly the most expeditious strategy to trying to advance this at an educational level.
That's great. So far what we've talked about is how we can impact our current students that are within the curriculum. How can we bridge this knowledge skill set that we're hopefully building in our emerging professionals with those pharmacists already in practice?
Great question. I think we're doing a little bit of that right now with this event, because most of the people attending this event are going to be alumni. And so it means that we've been out of school for a few years. The other part of it is we have a tremendous asset in our advanced pharmacy practice experience, or APPE, rotations and students. We have roughly 6,000 APPE rotations each year that touch 6,000 pharmacists and 6,000 practice sites across the province. If we are able to educate climate conscious pharmacy students who then go into practice and start to model climate conscious practice in their APPE rotations, their preceptors will learn, their preceptors will grow, their preceptors will see a way to actually make this real and valuable. So I'm very interested in the way in which our existing clinical training programs in APPEs can actually be really valuable. I think we also need to look at corporate leadership and perhaps even regulatory leadership in this space. Regulatory bodies, our licensing bodies, not just in pharmacy, but in the other health professions, they too have lots of competing demands. But in the same way that, you know, if you're a pharmacist in Ontario, you may have a practice advisor that comes to your pharmacy and looks at the way you renew prescriptions or adapt prescriptions or modify prescriptions, looks at your documentation and record keeping. If we can find ways of having regulatory bodies incorporate climate consciousness into the kind of practice reviews that many of us have already experienced, that's another potential lever that we can consider.
Those are great ideas. I always think that as a person who's been involved with a lot of teaching and on-site teaching, you do learn as a preceptor as much from your students as they do from you as the teacher or preceptor. I think the trick will be, how do we get people to be aware of that and to actually measure this as something that is happening, so that we can see how it's happening, if it's happening, to what extent it's happening. That's going to be the part that's really interesting in the future.
Yep.
Annalise.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you, Zubin, for that. Just picking up on that trail of sort of, you know, connections that could be made in the pharmacy space, and kind of kickstarting conversations that might lead to some change across the board. I'd like to pose my next question to Jamie. So your work at CASCADES has provided you great insight into working with lots of different individuals and organizations in the sustainability space. And so my first question is backing up a step and hoping you can tell us a little bit about who is CASCADES and what do you do? And then my second question to that is, who are some of the stakeholders that you and that your team at Cascades would really like to see at the table in discussions about environmental sustainability for our healthcare system at large?
Yeah, thanks, Annalise, for the question. So to answer the first part, Cascades Canada, led by Dr. Fiona Miller, we work on raising awareness of climate change and different health topics, and pharmacy being one of them. We connect thought leaders in this space, connecting, and as mentioned before, interprofessionalism was key. So working with different professions to co-develop some strategies and guidance. And lastly, just developing the educational piece is something that we're working on through Cascades. And then in terms of the second part of the questions, who are some of the important stakeholders to continue on these discussions? I would say first, our key stakeholders, which are pharmacists representing all practice settings and provinces. I think another important thing to think about is including pharmacy assistants and technicians who provide tremendous support and have a wealth of knowledge in pharmacy operations in these discussions. And another part is regarding interprofessionalism. And other stakeholders could include healthcare professionals, regulatory bodies, and industry to really identify the challenges and develop and eventually implement the solutions. And I'd like to speak a little bit more about working with regulatory bodies and industry. Based on my experiences working in global regulatory affairs and seeing the interactions and guidances that is involved for newly developed drugs to get to approval. It's surprising to see how many regulations there are in terms of, for example, what kind of vials should be used for a certain medication. What should we have on each vial's labels, or for oral pills or oral packs, what do we need on them to be compliant? So seeing all these intricacies of regulations and the role that these two organizations play, I think it'll be really important to include them in the discussions that we have, advocating for more environmentally sustainable medication development or biologics development, and ultimately work together for the environmentally sustainable healthcare system.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks. It's nice to hear a little bit more about all of the people that Cascades is drawing together to have some of these conversations and some of the outputs that are resulting from that. I don't know if you want to touch on some of the recent work Cascades has put out.
Yeah, I mean, a huge part of our work has been on inhalers, and Celia Cully has been working closely with Cascades to develop great resources and practical ones too that we can utilize. Some include templates to physicians, conversation starters with patients, and also patient handouts that all healthcare professionals can use. Other parts is the pharmacy piece, so providing overall recommendations on how we can guide more climate conscious pharmacy practices. And there are a lot more coming, again, perioperative care, telemedicine. So all healthcare topics I can think of, Cascades has a resource for that. So I recommend you to the audience to check out the Cascades website when you're available.
Thanks so much, Jamie. We'll hopefully encourage people to do that after today's session, but we'll also share some of those resources after. Emily, back to you.
Great, thank you. So Ifan, I want to ask you a question. You have such an interesting role working on a global level of health and well-being with the International Pharmaceutical Students Federation on climate-related partnerships. Can you tell us about where and how these conversations about environmental sustainability and global health fit into the pharmacy profession here in Canada?
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Emily. I think I'll touch upon the existing partners and potential partners for IPSF to give everyone an idea. And these organizations that I'm mentioning also have memberships for free that everyone can join. And I think that would be a great opportunity for anyone who's interested but don't know enough or would like to do something to join. So one of the first ones is YOUNGO. So that's the official youth constituency of UNFCCC, which is the UN agency on climate change. And it's basically a collective of youth that builds capacity for young people who are interested in this topic and inspire them to take climate action. So this is where, and within Youngo, there's actually a health working group. So specifically for recent graduates, if you're interested in taking more action, you can join Youngo, specifically the health working group. And we do have quite a few of our members who are IPSF members who are also Youngo members. On the kind of other hand, we also have GCHA, which is Global Climate and Health Alliance. So this is an alliance of health organizations who are concerned about climate change, and we work together to tackle climate change on a more policy level. So more recently, we signed on to a World Health Assembly resolution, which is presented to the WHO, which calls for a new climate change and health resolution that can respond to the level of threat that we're seeing now, and can also help maximize the health co-benefit opportunities. And within GCHA, there's also a youth group called Youth Climate and Health Network, and it was just launched last year in May. And this is more specifically for young people who are interested in climate change and are healthcare professionals. So this is another network that if you're interested in learning more, you can also join. And lastly, one of those partners is Planetary Health Report Card, which I've already mentioned. And it definitely needs more pharmacy professionals and kind of students to champion the evaluation of our universities or schools in terms of our inclusion on climate change. So that's these are the partners, and I will also mention some of the actions that we have taken as a federation. So one of the things that has just been mandated for us is we have to create sustainability reports in all of our events. And as part of this, our annual regional symposium that's happening in Europe, their main theme is actually sustainability in pharmacy practice. And they've also implemented vegetarian meals during the entire symposium, which, as you know, meat consumption is one of the large contributors to carbon emissions. And over there, they are also advocating for all the delegates to join, primarily by train travels over airplane travels. So I think something that can be applied in Canada is that whenever we hold gatherings or conferences, we can also think about how we can make things more sustainable. For example, do you really need those plastic name badges? Do you really need to incorporate full-on meat meals? And is it possible to travel more sustainably? So these are my points. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Annalise.
Thanks, Emily. We are getting somewhat close to the end of our structured time for our panel here before we flip over to audience question and answer. So short and sweet, to close off this section, what is one takeaway message or tip for our audience about how they could make their work more grounded in environmentally sustainable practice? Zubin, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for joining us today, if you are in our audience, or for viewing this event after the fact. The simple fact that you've taken time out of your busy and congested schedule to take an hour or 90 minutes to think about climate conscious pharmacy practice is actually exactly what we need. I get it. It's a really chaotic and busy and scary time in human history. We have inflation, we have Donald Trump, we have all manner of threats that seem to be coming at us from every direction. And as a result, it's really easy to think that something as big and nebulous and impersonal as climate change, mañana, we'll think about that tomorrow. If there is anything that I think we've sort of discussed today that I think is so important, is think about it today. Even if you do nothing about it, think about it today. Mindfulness, intentionality, climate consciousness really begins with simply thinking about it. And as you look around your world and you look around your practice and you look around your home, the opportunities that we have to put on a sweater, to walk rather than drive, to ask, does this patient really need this medication? these are the sorts of small, intentional, mindful, climate conscious steps in our personal and professional lives that over time will accumulate. Big corporations like Peter's will do what they need to do, and that's, of course, going to be incredibly impactful. But each of us in our small ways can and should do something, and we need to feel that we are part of the solution, not simply passive bystanders to something that other people are going to fix.
Thanks, Zubin. Jamie, I'll turn to you next.
Thanks, Annalise. Thanks, Zubin. I mean, my takeaway message is also quite similar to what's been said. I just wanted to say that today, everyone here who has joined and those who will listen to it later is already contributing to a more environmentally sustainable pharmacy practice. There has been topics that have been mentioned, as Zubin said, being mindful, taking small steps, as what Peter has shared. From today's event, we are all expanding our knowledge on this issue, whether it's your first time hearing about this issue or you're continuing to grow your knowledge in this area. We are all starting together and we're continuing to engage in these conversations. My hopes are that through this event, we continue to have these conversations and really incorporate them in any shape or form. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Ethan, I'll turn to you next.
I think we do have a common theme. I wanted to say that a lot of the climate change conversations has been centered around, oh, it's going to affect our future, it's going to affect the next generation, but it's actually affecting us now. So it's really important for us to take action, think about it now, and also, again, look around to see who's in the room, who's not in the room, and get everybody together to work on our now together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Peter, a last tip or takeaway message before we go to the audience.
For sure. I guess for me, if there is one message that I hope resonates from this discussion, yes, we have the resources to talk about significant numbers in the interventions that we've made, but small changes do make a tangible and measurable difference. For example, we worked with vendors on, we use CPAC as an example to make them recyclable. I think other companies can do the same. You don't have to, you can challenge them for, again, to work with those vendors for those same types of materials. Chances are we probably use the same vendors anyway. We talked about inventory management, so reducing unnecessary medication waste. This is a change that can easily be implemented in your day-to-day operations. If anything, will also decrease the expense line for the pharmacy. And finally, thinking outside of the box. It's not just about plastic reduction or medication waste. Consider how your recommendations, your interventions, as we discussed, have an impact on patient care and that environmental stewardship. We talked about deprescribing. And I think finally, just continuing education and ongoing interest in this topic with intent in environmental stewardship, not only as a pharmacist, but as an individual, is how we're going to see a significant kind of a headwind on what we know is irreversible, but we definitely think have a long way to go to where we can be proud of the interventions and changes that we have made.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I completely agree. I think, it's fantastic to sort of center this discussion somewhat around pharmacy, but on an individual level, it's absolutely so important. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this first portion. I'm going to turn it over to Emily now, who's going to get us started with our audience question and answer.
Great. And just to remind everyone, please do send us more questions through the live chat. We're going to try to pick as many of those as possible and pass them on to our panelists. So we have two individuals within the audience who are asking questions about a similar topic. So I'm going to group them together and discuss them now. So the one individual said, what are the alternatives to plastic pill bottles? Are there any options in the pipeline, i.e. glass, likely more expensive? What about biodegradable plastic? We also have a similar topic being brought up by another audience member who says, if alternatives exist, how do you search looking at the prescription paper pill bottles, things like that? They would be curious to know if shoppers and other drugstores have considered these types of alternatives. Peter, you're probably the best person to discuss this.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about the bags and how we are cycling away to now having fully recyclable patient bags for our patients, in reduction to the plastic that we use for our bottles, in particular to the compounding vials that you will see. There's a new company, actually, there's a third-party vendor that has a one-size vial where the bottom is shifted in increments of 15, 30, or 60 mils. So instead of having three different types of sized vials with three different sized lids, it's that one vial that, again, the pharmacist can decide on how much of that volume they want to put in. So absolutely, I think there's definitely some innovation happening when it comes to just the volume of these kind of bottles. And again, I think there's definitely, you're looking at some different materials that are being used that are much more sustainable for the overall plastic. So it's not about just recyclability, but also just the overall reduction of plastic that we're looking into as well. Exciting times in that regard, for sure.
It is. And I would say for pharmacists who perhaps don't know too much about this topic, are really just starting to explore it now and are interested because they've now attended this panel discussion, where do they find out about alternatives? What is the best way if they want to try to decrease wastage within their own pharmacies? And anyone can answer this.
So if I can maybe just start, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues on the panel. Ask. You don't need to know everything, but if you see something, you're a pharmacist working, doing your job in your pharmacy, and you see something, you see an opportunity, you wonder, wow, we have these enormous garbage bags every day that keep going out of there. Isn't there a better way? Ask your managers, ask your district managers, ask the people that are running your pharmacy. The innovations that Peter described in terms of scalable vials or perhaps a shift to recyclable bags, that all came about because pharmacists asked questions. Not just one pharmacist, many pharmacists, but your voice really matters. Vendors will change practices when they know there is a market to do so, but they don't know there's a market to do so if we're not asking questions about this now. Rather than just simply shrug our shoulders and go, wow, that's just a lot of garbage that goes out of the pharmacy every day. Ask questions that are based on your own experience.
Great, thank you.
And I'll also quickly jump in. I personally already know two, vendors who sell these more sustainable prescription vials. So if you just look on Google, Canada drug vial sustainable, then you can see these different options pop up, and then you can do a little bit more research into which one would fit better within your practice. But again, if you create that demand, there will be a lot more vendors who will convert into that space, and then you'll also have a lot more options.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to Zubin's point on asking questions and sharing best practices. For those who have like a QID account, there is a community developed by CAPhE, the Canadian Association of Pharmacy for the Environment. It's quite active, where they share great resources, ask questions, share opportunities. So I would encourage the audience members to also join the QID channel and ask away any questions.
Great, thank you.
And maybe just also attend certain conferences. I think there's some incredible ideas that are out of these conferences that pharmacists, OPA, or other provincial groups have. So attend conferences, speak with vendors, challenge them on what it is that you would want to have for your business. And I think that would be a great way to continue that conversation.
And maybe one more idea, make this a team sport. This is not just you railing at a brick wall. You work with other people, you work with technicians, you work with students, you work with front shop staff, you work with people in the back. But as a group, look around where you work. You're in the best position to identify what can be our priorities. If you don't know something, maybe somebody else does. If you don't know what QID is and you're not joining groups online, somebody else who's maybe younger and more technologically interested might be doing things like that. Climate consciousness is a team sport, not an individual activity.
I think I hear a challenge there for our audience members. We were hearing a lot of ideas from our panelists. So pick at least one of them and see where you can actually apply them within this next month. Annalise.
Thanks, Emily. Our next audience question I thought was a really interesting one, and it gets at sort of a number of pieces that each of our panelists have talked about. So the question is, do any of the formulary related bodies such as CADCADE, provincial formulary committees, etc., take into consideration the impact on the planet when providing recommendations for covering medications? So for example, which medications might be covered, which ones might be delisted? I'll maybe just open this question to the panel.
So maybe I could start and say the answer is ish. There is, I think, growing awareness and understanding amongst these kind of big health technology assessment panels and formulary steering groups. It's not yet reached, I think, in a very significant way, the level of policy and enforcement, but I think this is the general move and direction. We actually see, I think, this being most realized is in hospitals through the P&T or Pharmacy and Therapeutics committees, where climate consciousness and climate footprints are becoming much more explicitly embedded in purchasing decisions. And there are large collective hospital purchasing groups that are foregrounding climate impacts as influencing their decisions. I think this day is coming very quickly when, for example, ODB and CADCADE and other groups will be explicitly integrating climate impacts as part of their thinking. And that day is really rapidly coming, and we're seeing responses already coming fast and furious, I would say, from pharmaceutical manufacturers. And Jamie, you got a bit of a background in the industry. Can I ask, maybe you can pick up on that a bit?
Thanks, Zubin. I'm actually not quite familiar as I work in non-Canadian markets, but yeah, like I mentioned, I think there is a growing interest, and there are industry recommendations and guidances on how both government and industry should work towards. So I would look out for any newsletters or upcoming guidances from health authority websites.
And Jamie, I don't know if you want to speak a little more on some of the guidance documents CASCADES has really produced that do provide some direction, I'll say, for pharmacists.
For sure. In terms of coverage, I know there is an inhaler comparison chart that pharmacists can take a look at. So there are more practical resources that we can use. But I believe those are specific to Ontario, so it may not be as applicable to other provinces. But yeah, I would really invite everyone to take a look at the resources to see how it fits in your practice.
Great, thank you. Thoughts from our other panelists on this question?
I also don't really know if CADCADE already evaluates that information, but I also have the doubt that there's not a lot of information that's available on the kind of carbon emissions and also the sustainability from the manufacturers. So I would like to say that if it's possible for these manufacturers to start recording the carbon footprint of not only the medications, but also the manufacturing process and also the transportation, there's a lot of things associated with each of the medications. If that information can be made available, then it would really help in terms of the further evaluations down the line.
Where I'm actually most familiar with this is in the context of medical gases. So anesthetics, for example, which have enormous carbon impacts. And that one particular, I know that's not something that typical community pharmacy is very involved in, but where sort of the template for this in other therapeutic categories is probably going to come from is the work done around enumerating carbon impacts of medical gases. And that's a very, very significant area of interest for lots of hospital P&T committees.
Just wanted to add a bit more about some like international examples that we could utilize as well. So there's a lot of EU examples where, for example, like FASS, the Swedish National Formulary, provides some ecotoxicity information for a lot of the prescription medications. We do have to be mindful that is international, but it does provide a great resource for those who want to read more about the ecotoxicity of commonly used medications. And perhaps in the future, we could move towards having labels for whether it's more environmentally sustainable. Like I know that in Sweden, they do have like a symbol for OTC products. If they meet a certain criteria, they would have this particular sticker. Maybe that could inform healthcare providers as well as consumers.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Sweden has been doing some really interesting work. Unsurprisingly, I guess the Scandinavian countries in general have been doing some interesting work in this area. Great. If there's no other thoughts from our panel on that one, then Emily, I'll let you take it away with the next question.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in. This question is from a hospital pharmacist. So this person says, I work in a hospital in organ transplant, and they put in brackets, one of the ultimate recycling programs. So their question is, how are hospitals changing practice in order to have a positive impact on climate change? And can any of our speakers on the panel answer this? What are your thoughts on this?
And so depending on the specific hospital you work at, you may or may not, your hospital may or may not belong to a group buying organization such as HealthPro. And these group buying organizations represent hospitals across Canada, and on the one hand, negotiate, good financial deals, but also then have the clout to demand certain kinds of climate targets from the manufacturers. And so the idea, even though hospitals are big organizations, they become bigger when their buying power is combined through these group buying organizations. Christine Donaldson is the interim president of HealthPro and has done a lot of work. She's quite an advocate in this space, done quite a lot of work to incorporate climate consciousness into their procurement decisions. And their procurement decisions are the things that end up on the shelves of many hospitals across Canada. They also provide a lot of resources to guide P&T committees, pharmacy and therapeutic committees, in assessing what should be on a specific hospital formulary as well, where I think there's some opportunities for further work in hospitals is around education of physicians, nurses, and residents, education of patients, and actually not simply leaving it to procurement people to deal with all the climate stuff, but thinking again about how, as an individual pharmacist with our scope of practice, how can we educate people? How can we motivate people? And how can we actually use our scope of practice to its utmost in order to reduce climate impacts?
And I think a lot of the things that the panelists have discussed in other pharmacy environments really apply to hospitals as well, right? Whether it's the role the pharmacist plays in de-prescribing, in the packaging that is being used, in the repackaging that we are doing, and from a hospital perspective with regards to, energy efficiency and what's happening with, how often lights are on, air conditioning, et cetera.
I'm a bit hesitant to discuss this, but you sort of just inspired me, Emily. Mm-hmm. One of the areas I'm personally really interested in trying to get some funding to explore in more detail is in the area of something that is called hygiene theater. Hygiene theater refers to the very intricate dance all healthcare professionals do in order to convey to the public a sense that healthcare is sterile, it's clean, and therefore it's absolutely safe. So, for example, one piece of hygiene theater that so many of us take for granted is the use of alcohol swabs prior to vaccinations. Many of the people listening, you would have participated in the COVID drive, and thank you for doing that. And if you think about the literally millions, if not billions, of tiny foil packages that were opened, tiny pieces of alcoholized paper were then unwrapped and swabbed against a person's arm. And then where do they go? Into landfill. Is there any evidence that alcohol swabbing actually does anything? Does it actually reduce the risks of infection? We don't know, actually. It's a piece of hygiene theater we've just all accepted as being really important, really meaningful, but is good injection practice that doesn't require billions of tiny foil packages to be opened. Could that be just as effective? There are so many things we do in healthcare that we just have always done because we think it's clean. But does it matter? And we know it does matter from a carbon footprint perspective. Perhaps another very controversial area, again, this is the sort of research that I'm interested in doing in the years ahead, electronic health records. Electronic health records have been sold as being climate friendly because you don't have paper flying all over the place. You don't have faxes and written prescriptions. And of course, that's going to be climate friendly, right? Well, there's lots of reasons to like electronic health records, but I'm not entirely convinced that the environment is one of them. As many of you know, the data encryption that is necessary to protect the privacy of health records consumes an extraordinary amount of electricity. Data encryption, if you've read anything about, for example, cryptocurrency and bit mining and all of that kind of stuff, data encryption is incredibly energy intensive. And at least right now, most of the electricity that's generated to support data encryption is coming from fossil fuel sources. And so it's not entirely clear if electronic health records are actually carbon neutral or carbon saving. We actually have a pretty good infrastructure to recycle paper, frankly. And while there's great reasons for electronic health records, I'm not dissing them at all. Maybe examining some of the things that we think are actually climate friendly or hygiene friendly practices. This is going to be part of the next frontier of I think, research in this space.
Thank you. I think at this point we've asked the questions that have come from our recent live chats, but we do have various questions that were submitted prior to the panel. And I'm going to just pick a few of them and start us off, and Annalise is going to jump in as well. One that I was very interested in really asked about working together. You know, I'm all about collaboration. And the question was asking about how can the pharmacy profession work with other healthcare stakeholders, including healthcare executives, to advance this initiative. Now, many of you around the panel have talked about other stakeholders. I'd like to expand it even beyond this question. So how do we learn from people even beyond healthcare? There are many people out there that have been worried about climate change for a while now, have been trying to do things linked to climate change. Can we learn from stakeholders even beyond healthcare? Who are they? What are the things they've done that we should take into account? And how do we apply that to our own practice? Who would like to try? Jump in there.
I'll jump in here. I think the evolution of technology, right? And Zubin mentioned it in regards to some potential unseen impact that there will be there. But we talked briefly about AI and the role that maybe this will play in the management of things like medications, providing solutions that will support more kind of an improved environmental stewardship. So I do feel that there is a role that technology will play in providing some answers that will allow us to, again, find more impactful ways to mitigate some of the impact that we're having on the environment. Simply like logistics, hydrogen or electric vehicles, right? These medications need to be delivered to our stores. Do we, by converting to electric vehicles, what will that impact be on, again, the environment from a reduction in fossil fuels? So I think that's one piece of the puzzle that I think will naturally have to play a big part.
Thank you.
I'll also jump on the train about digital health and AI. I think there's a lot of potential in terms of optimizing the work that we do. So as Peter mentioned before, operational management and also managing the waste could be something that AI does for us in terms of predicting the needs for medication, so we can optimize so that we don't have as much expiration of medications or waste from there. And also, I think it could also help us get more organized. So, for example, during COVID, we had a lot of COVID vaccines, and we saw a lot of that going to waste because we weren't sure how many people were needing that on that day. And there were some digital solutions that helped us kind of transform our community pharmacy into a more appointment-based model, and that has helped immensely with the inventory management for medications and vaccines in general. So I think that would be something else that we can definitely learn from. Another thing, it's not really learning from their practice, but learning from people's experiences. So one of the things that I learned from attending conferences at different countries is that I learned from people who have actually been more severely impacted by climate change. And these are actually people who are from lower and middle income countries. And one particular individual really has touched me and helped me motivate me in this journey is that he's from Tuvalu, a small island country that's probably one of the first to get flooded. And he's just really anxious. They get floods every other day, every 3 days, and it just kind of floods their entire house. And for them, a lot of people can say, oh, you can migrate to another country or you can go somewhere else. But that's not really what this is about. It's their country, their culture, their practice that they have kind of developed based on where they live. And moving to a different place is not exactly where what they were hoping for. So I think learning from other people's experiences can help us kind of understand a bit more about why climate change is really, really important.
Great, thank you. Anyone else before we pass on this question?
I would like to add, and I think another group of stakeholders that we would work closely with is like building operations or architects. It's considering how our workspace is changing and also looking at our current pharmacies to look into how we can make our pharmacy or workplace more energy efficient. I think there'll be further conversations as needed to identify is there a standard for pharmacies that we would like to implement in terms of like the lighting, water, what type of light bulbs used, for instance. And a great resource for that is the Green Office Toolkit that has been developed by the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare. It's geared towards clinicians and office managers, but I can see intersections with pharmacies or more clinical workspaces. So I think that's a great resource for us to take a look at initially.
Great. Anyone else?
I think there's also an opportunity for the government to support in this regard, looking at investment in local infrastructure for generic manufacturers, for example, and not have to have international medications being delivered to our stores. So are there investments in kind of environment sustainable type of solutions that the government can have that we would naturally then have a cascade effect on the day-to-day operations and management of our pharmacies. So we need to make our voices heard, as Zubin mentioned. It is something that we need to do as a group, and to make sure that it's clear of how important this is as a priority for us, as part of what we do, as part of our profession.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask, this is probably going to be one of our last questions. We're getting close to the 8:30 mark, but one of the groups that probably we haven't fully engaged in on this topic are our patients. And they are a large group of individuals. I don't think there are too many people out there who haven't used medications at some point, come into contact with pharmacists or a pharmacy at some point in their lives. How do we galvanize this very large group of individuals out there who are in some way linked to medications, pharmacies, pharmacists, so that they know what they can do about climate change and understand what the current issues are? And, so they know like what part they can play in this. So what are your thoughts on this? And I'll just ask each of you in turn to just speak up on your thoughts. Should we start with Zubin?
Sure. So from my perspective, from an educational perspective, one of the things that we're trying to incorporate into our community is risk assessment tools that students and pharmacists can use to identify individual patients who may be at higher risk for climate-related adverse drug events. We talk a lot about adverse drug events. We talk about drug-drug interactions or drug-food interactions, but the idea of expanding that to think about drug-climate interactions is relatively new. We know that many drugs predispose individuals to dehydration. Dehydration predisposes individuals, particularly the elderly, to falls. And so simply understanding that and providing that kind of education to patients and to their other healthcare professionals, I think really starts to personalize the realities of climate change, that actually you are now affected by climate change. And we don't need to look that far. Look at what's happening right now on the east. Like Peter's in the Maritimes right now. And if you're following the news, you know that in the Maritimes right now, they're having horrendous wildfires. And it's May. Wildfire season began in Alberta at the beginning of May. This is not something that is happening only in Tuvalu or in other places. It's happening in Canada. It's happening right outside my window here in Lake Erie. As Lake Erie's shoreline continues to erode and flooding here becomes more common. Sharing those personal experiences that we have and personalizing climate change so that individuals realize this isn't something I'm seeing on TV. I'm at risk now. This is not something that you're a physician's own patient who is at risk of climate-related harms. These are the sorts of things that I think really personalize it, really prioritize it, and that's going to really help galvanize.
Thank you. And Peter, since Zubin mentioned you, I'm going to jump to you next.
Really, I couldn't have said it any better. I think it's building on that education in a preventative way with our patients as well. So climate change is real. We are feeling it. So we talked about how can we educate patients on things like skin cancer and provide those interventions in a way to prevent something that is, we're going to be more prone or higher risk to. In Ontario, one of the minor ailments where we're able to now provide assessment and intervention is for ticks. So again, education during these types of seasons where we have very close relationships with our patients. We know generally when they're going to the cottage because they're coming for a vacation supply. Having those conversations ahead of time so they know what tools they have available and for us to be able to help support them if and when that need arises. So building on what Zubin said and looking at it from a preventative health perspective as well, I think is important.
Thank you. Jamie, your thoughts?
Yes, building upon the education piece, I think one topic that's is probably more relevant now is the heat-related illnesses. So it could be heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Nowadays the global average temperature across the world are rising. So I expect there are higher incidences of these heat-related illnesses. So just talking about some of the risks or early signs with your patients, discussing not only impacts their health, but also how should they handle their medications that are sensitive to heat. There's multi-layers that we could continue having discussions with our patients. And I do think like these climate-related health threats are topics that we need to further discuss with our patients.
Great. And Ifan, last but not least.
Yes, I also agree with all the other panelists who have mentioned about making it more personal to patients and also mentioning the climate-related diseases. So, for example, the respiratory diseases, including asthma, that can be exacerbated by the air pollution that's caused from climate change. And there's also increased incidences of allergy because of the climate changes and the flower seasons change, and people can be having their allergy symptoms earlier or later than they were expecting. So there's a lot of things that can be really relevant to our patients. And another thing is actually the infectious diseases. So vector-borne diseases with the temperature increasing. For example, mosquitoes can reproduce at areas that they could not really reproduce well before, and that can definitely increase a lot of the chances for mosquito-related diseases. So putting that more into perspective can help patients better understand the importance of climate change, and also not only kind of providing them with this scary information, but also providing them with potential solutions, what they can do on an individual level, and also what they can ask for, since they're the clients of all healthcare professionals. Then that could help us build a much greener and sustainable healthcare system.
Great, thank you. Annalise, back to you.
Thank you, Ifan. I think you put that so well. I think our conversation tonight has focused on, there are many problems, many tangents of climate change and climate conscious practice. But I think the thing that I am going home with tonight is really how much our group has focused on solutions. And I really hope that the audience can also walk away with that same sense of, I now have one or two things that maybe I can adopt in my everyday life, and that'll slowly create some change, and then also offer to their community and to their team, as Zubin was talking about. So we are going to wrap up our event for tonight. It's almost 8:30, but before we say goodbye, I would just like to extend a few thank yous. Our first thank you is A huge thank you to our generous sponsor, Shoppers Drug Mart, for supporting this panel and also for sharing information on how you're making climate conscious pharmacy a real priority. So thank you, Peter, in particular, for your thoughts. I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to Peter and our other panelists tonight, Zubin, Ifan, and Jamie, who have shared such incredible insights from such different corners of pharmacy practice and also from such different corners of their personal lives. So thank you to each of you. And our final thank you goes to you, our incredible audience tonight. We're very grateful for your engagement and participation, especially in a topic such as this. And we invite you to stay up to date on this and other upcoming alumni offerings by visiting pharmacy.utoronto.ca and also following our alumni Facebook page and LinkedIn.